They threw him out at 65. Then his dog uncovered a buried secret powerful men would pay millions to silence. Kicked out at 65, a Navy SEAL bought a $5 log cabin. His dog found what they hid inside. When Ethan Cole signed the papers and walked away from his own home, he thought the worst was behind him. But deep in the Colorado mountains, inside a rotting $5 cabin no one wanted, his loyal German shepherd caught a scent that would change everything. What they found beneath those floorboards wasn't forgotten. It was hidden, and someone was coming back for it. Comment 1 if you'd stand your ground, or 0 if you'd walk away, and tell us where you're watching from. The pen didn't make much noise, just a soft, steady scratch across paper, barely louder than a breath. But to Ethan Cole, it sounded like something final. Like a door closing somewhere deep inside him, one that wouldn't open again. He sat at the kitchen table he had built himself 30 years ago. The wood still carried faint knife marks from family dinners long gone, the edges worn smooth from years of quiet use. Afternoon light filtered through the blinds, casting thin lines across the surface, cutting the room into shadows and silence. Across from him, his daughter, Melissa, kept her eyes fixed on the documents. She didn't look angry. She didn't look sad. Just distant. Like someone waiting for a task to be completed. Her husband, Darren, stood near the counter, arms folded, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. Impatient but careful not to show it too much. Just sign at the bottom, Darren said, his voice calm, controlled. That's all we need. Ethan didn't respond right away. His fingers rested on the pen, steady but heavier than they should have been. At 65, his hands still carried the strength of a man who had spent decades in places where hesitation got people killed. But this wasn't a battlefield. There were no enemies in sight. No gunfire. No orders. Just paper. And silence. At his feet, Shadow sat perfectly still. The German shepherd's dark eyes moved between Ethan and the others, reading the room in a way no one else could. His ears were slightly back, his posture alert but restrained, not aggressive, not yet. Waiting. Ethan finally signed. His name, Ethan Cole, pressed into the paper with a firmness that didn't match what he felt inside. He set the pen down slowly, the small click echoing louder than it should have. "That's it?" he asked. Melissa nodded without lifting her gaze. "That's it." No explanation, no conversation, no acknowledgement of what had just happened. Darren stepped forward, gathering the papers quickly, as if afraid they might disappear if left unattended. "We'll handle the rest," he said. "You don't need to worry about anything." Ethan let out a breath, but it didn't feel like relief. "Where am I supposed to go?" he asked. It wasn't a challenge. It wasn't even anger. Just a question. Melissa hesitated for half a second. Then she stood, smoothing her sweater like she had somewhere else to be. "You'll figure it out," she said quietly. Darren added, "You always do." Ethan nodded once. He had, in places far worse than this. But those places had rules, structure, a purpose. This didn't. Shadow stood as Ethan pushed back from the table. The dog stayed close, brushing lightly against his leg, grounding him in the moment. Ethan reached down without thinking, resting his hand briefly on Shadow's head. The familiar weight of it steadied him. No one said goodbye. No one followed him to the door. He stepped outside into the late afternoon air, the cold hitting him sharper than expected. The suburban street stretched out ahead, quiet, orderly, unchanged, as if nothing inside that house had just ended. Ethan walked to the driveway where his old truck sat. Most of his things were already gone, packed, moved, or left behind without ceremony. All that remained was a single duffel bag in the bed of the truck. He picked it up. It wasn't heavy. That was the part that caught him off guard. 40 years of life, and this was what it weighed now. Shadow jumped down from the porch and moved to his side without command. "Yeah," Ethan muttered under his breath. "Let's go." They didn't drive far. By the time the sun dipped low behind the distant Rockies, Ethan found himself pulled off along a narrow stretch of road just outside town. No destination, no plan, just distance between him and the house that was no longer his. He turned off the engine. The silence that followed was immediate and complete. No voices, no movement, no decisions waiting to be made. Just the sound of wind moving faintly through dry grass and the ticking of the engine cooling. Ethan stepped out of the truck. The sky had shifted into deep orange and fading blue, the mountains in the distance cutting sharp against the horizon. It was the kind of view people paid money to see. He barely noticed it. Shadow circled once, then settled near him, facing outward, always watching. Ethan leaned against the side of the truck, his eyes fixed somewhere far beyond the road. For a moment, something flickered. Not anger, not grief, something smaller, something quieter. A memory of who he had been, a man who led teams through darkness, a man who made decisions that mattered, a man who knew exactly where he stood. That man felt very far away now. Ethan exhaled slowly. "Guess this is it," he said. Shadow didn't move, but his ears twitched slightly, catching the tone more than the words. A car passed on the road behind them, headlights sweeping briefly across the scene before disappearing into the distance. No one slowed down. No one looked twice. To them, it was just another man on the side of the road. Ethan adjusted his grip on the duffel bag and set it down at his feet. He didn't feel panic. He didn't feel fear, not even anger. Just emptiness. The kind that comes after everything important has already happened, and nothing is left to fight. The wind picked up slightly, colder now as night began to settle in. Shadow stood and moved closer, pressing gently against Ethan's leg. Solid, present, real. Ethan glanced down at him, then back out at the darkening horizon. "All right," he said quietly. Not to Shadow, not to anyone, just to the silence, because whether he felt it or not, this wasn't the end. It just felt like one. The last light slipped behind the mountains, and the world turned gray. Ethan Cole stood on the side of a road with nothing left, and no idea what came next. But Shadow stayed exactly where he belonged, right beside him. The night passed without much sleep. Ethan sat in the driver's seat for a while, then stretched out in the back of the truck, his jacket pulled tight against the cold. The temperature dropped faster than he expected. Colorado nights had a way of doing that. Warm light fading into something sharp and unforgiving. Shadow never fully rested. The dog shifted positions quietly, always keeping one eye open, ears flicking at distant sounds Ethan couldn't hear. Once or twice, Ethan woke to the low rumble of a warning growl, but each time Shadow settled again, as if whatever he sensed had passed. By morning, the sky was pale and empty. Ethan sat up slowly, his joints stiff, his breath visible in the cold air. For a moment, he didn't move. He just watched the horizon, letting the silence settle again. No plan had formed overnight, no sudden clarity. Just the same truth sitting where it had been the night before. He had nowhere to go. Shadow stood and stretched, then nudged Ethan's arm with his nose. Firm, deliberate. "Yeah," Ethan muttered. "I hear you." He climbed out of the truck, boots crunching against gravel, and looked back toward the road. A town lay a few miles behind him, small, forgettable, but it had something he needed. Information. By mid-morning, Ethan pulled into a quiet mountain town, tucked between rising slopes of pine and stone. The kind of place where nothing changed quickly and strangers stood out without trying. The buildings were low and weathered, a diner with a flickering sign, a gas station with one working pump, and near the end of the street, a county office that looked older than everything around it. Ethan parked. Shadow jumped down beside him, instantly alert again, scanning the unfamiliar space. Inside, the air smelled like paper and dust. A single overhead fan turned slowly, its rhythm uneven, as if it had forgotten why it was still running. A woman sat behind the counter flipping through a stack of files, barely glancing up as the door creaked open. "You looking for something?" she asked without much interest. Ethan stepped forward, duffel bag still slung over his shoulder. "Place to stay," he said. "Cheap." The woman gave a short, dry laugh. "Aren't we all?" She pushed a few papers aside and reached for a thin folder, flipping through it with slow, practiced movements. Somewhere in the room, a radio played quietly, old country music, low enough to blend into the background. A couple of men sat near the window, nursing coffee and watching without pretending not to. "Not much available," the woman said. "Especially not cheap." Ethan nodded once. He expected that. Shadow stood close, his posture calm but watchful, his eyes moving from person to person, picking up details Ethan didn't need to think about anymore. The woman paused mid-page. "Well," she said slowly, pulling out a single sheet. "There is one thing." She slid the paper across the counter. Ethan picked it up. It was a photograph, faded, slightly warped at the edges. A log cabin stood alone in a clearing, surrounded by dense forest. The roof sagged. The windows were boarded. The structure leaned just enough to suggest it might not last another winter. Below it, typed in small letters, price, $5. Ethan frowned slightly. "That real?" he asked. The woman shrugged. "Been sitting there for years. No utilities, no road access half the time. Structure's probably not safe." One of the men by the window let out a low chuckle. "You'd be better off sleeping under a bridge," he said. The other added, "If the place doesn't fall on you first." A few quiet laughs followed. Ethan didn't react. He just looked at the photo again. Something about it felt off. Not the condition, not the isolation. Something else. Beside him, Shadow stiffened. It was subtle at first. A slight shift in posture, ears rising forward, body tightening in place. His eyes locked onto the image in Ethan's hand. Focused. Intent. Not curious. Alert. Ethan noticed. His grip on the paper tightened just slightly. "What's wrong with it?" he asked. The woman leaned back in her chair. "Nothing official. Just, people don't go near it. Too far out. No reason to." "That it?" Ethan asked. She met his eyes for the first time. "That's enough, usually." Ethan looked down at Shadow. The dog hadn't moved. Still locked on the image. Still tense. Ethan exhaled slowly. Most people would have laughed. Most people would have walked away. But Ethan Cole wasn't most people. He had spent his life walking toward things others avoided. Danger didn't scare him. Silence didn't scare him. What scared him was having no direction at all. He set the paper down gently. "I'll take it." The room went quiet. The man by the window shook his head. "You serious?" Ethan didn't look at him. "Yes." The woman studied him for a long second, something shifting behind her expression. Not concern, not judgment. Recognition. "All right," she said finally, reaching for a form. "Your call." The paperwork didn't take long. There wasn't much to transfer. No inspections, no conditions, just a signature. Ethan signed again. This time it felt different. Not like something ending. Like something uncertain. When the woman handed him the key, it felt lighter than expected. Small, cold, worn from time. Ethan turned it over once in his hand. $5. That was all it took now. Not to rebuild a life, just to start moving again. Outside, the sun had climbed higher, but the air still carried that mountain chill. Ethan stepped out onto the street, shadow immediately falling into place beside him. The town looked the same, quiet, unchanged. But something had shifted, not around him, inside him. A man walked past, glancing briefly at the key in Ethan's hand. "You bought that place?" he asked. Ethan nodded. The man gave a short, humorless laugh. "Hope you like ghosts." Ethan didn't answer. He didn't believe in ghosts, but he believed in instincts. And right now, Shadow's instincts were telling him something he couldn't ignore. Ethan slipped the key into his pocket and looked toward the mountains rising in the distance. The road ahead wasn't clear. It wasn't safe. And it sure as hell didn't make sense. But it was something. And for the first time since yesterday, that was enough. Shadow moved first, stepping forward, ready. Ethan followed. Whatever waited in those mountains, they were going to find it. Together. The road out of town narrowed faster than Ethan expected. Within minutes, pavement turned to cracked asphalt, then to gravel, then to something that barely qualified as a road at all. Pine trees thickened on both sides, rising taller and closer together, blocking out the sky until only thin strips of light remained. Ethan drove slowly, not because he didn't trust the truck, because he trusted the terrain. The mountains had a way of reminding people who was in charge. Shadow sat upright in the passenger seat, his posture rigid, head angled slightly toward the windshield. Every movement outside, the flicker of branches, the distant motion of wind through trees, registered in him first. Ethan noticed. He always did. "You see something I don't?" Ethan muttered. Shadow didn't move, didn't blink, just watched. The deeper they went, the quieter it became. No passing cars, no distant engines. No signs of life except the occasional broken fence post or rusted marker half buried in snow. Then the signal dropped. Ethan glanced at his phone once before tossing it onto the dashboard. Didn't matter. Out here, the only thing that mattered was what you could see, hear, and feel. The road climbed steadily. Snow patches began appearing along the edges, then spreading across the path itself. The truck tires crunched over it, slipping slightly before catching again. Ethan adjusted without thinking. Old instincts, muscle memory, the kind you don't lose. Hours passed, or maybe it was less. Time had a way of bending when everything looked the same. At one point, Ethan slowed the truck to a near stop. A sharp turn ahead dropped off along a narrow ridge, the mountains opening briefly to reveal a vast stretch of white and gray below. The wind moved across it like something alive. Ethan stared out for a moment, and just like that, he wasn't in Colorado anymore. The air changed, the silence shifted, the snow became sand. A different landscape, a different time, a different war. Gunfire cracked somewhere in the distance, the sound sharp, immediate, a radio voice shouting coordinates, boots hitting ground too fast, someone yelling his name. "Ethan!" He blinked. The steering wheel tightened under his grip. The truck idled where it sat. Shadow pressed hard against his arm. Solid, real, grounding. Ethan sucked in a breath, then another. The mountain air cut cold into his lungs, forcing the memory back where it belonged. Gone, but not gone enough. "Yeah," he said quietly, his voice rough. "I'm here." Shadow didn't move away. He stayed close until Ethan's breathing evened out, until the tension left his shoulders. Only then did the dog shift his attention back to the road ahead. Always working, always watching. Ethan drove on. The terrain grew rougher, the road barely visible now under fresh snow and fallen branches. More than once he had to stop, step out, and clear the way just enough to pass. Each time Shadow moved ahead of him, scanning, listening, waiting. Not just for animals. For something else, Ethan didn't question it. He had learned a long time ago, when a trained dog reacts, you pay attention. You don't argue. You don't guess. You trust. The sun began to dip again by the time the road finally ended. No sign, no marker, just nothing. A dead end where the path disappeared into dense forest and rising terrain. Ethan killed the engine. For a moment, neither of them moved. The silence settled in around them, thick and complete. Then Shadow jumped down. His paws hit the snow softly, but his body went immediately rigid, focused. Ethan stepped out, grabbing his duffel bag. Cold air rushed in around him, sharper now, carrying the scent of pine and something deeper, older. He looked around. No cabin, no clearing, just trees. "Great," he muttered. $5 well spent. But Shadow had already started moving. Not randomly, not exploring, leading. His path cut slightly to the right, weaving between trees with purpose, his head low, tracking something invisible. Ethan hesitated for half a second, then followed. The forest closed in around them. Branches brushed against his shoulders. Snow shifted under his boots. The light faded quickly as the trees thickened, turning everything into shades of gray and shadow. Shadow never slowed. Every few steps, he would stop, lift his head slightly, listen, then continue, like he knew exactly where he was going. Ethan's breath grew heavier, more from the terrain than the cold. The incline steepened, forcing him to use the trees for balance as they climbed. Minutes passed. Then more. Just as Ethan was about to call it, the trees opened. A clearing. Small. Hidden. And at the center of it, the cabin. Ethan stopped. For a long moment. He didn't move. It looked worse than the photo. The structure leaned slightly to one side. Its logs darkened with age and weather. The roof sagged under old snow. Boards covered the windows, nailed in place without care. No smoke, no tracks, no life. But something about it didn't feel empty. Shadow didn't approach. He stood at the edge of the clearing, body tense, ears forward, a low sound building in his throat. Not a bark, not a growl. Something deeper. Warning. Ethan stepped forward slowly, each step deliberate, measured, the same way he had approached unknown structures in places far more dangerous than this. "Easy," he said quietly. Not to Shadow, to himself. The wind moved through the clearing, brushing against the cabin walls with a hollow sound. Ethan reached the door. It hung slightly crooked, the wood warped and split from years of neglect. He stopped just short of touching it. Listened. Nothing. No movement. No sound from inside. Just silence. Too perfect. Too still. Behind him, Shadow let out a low, steady growl. Ethan glanced back. The dog hadn't moved. Wouldn't cross the threshold. That was enough. Ethan turned back to the door. Whatever was inside, it wasn't just a place to sleep. It was something else. Something waiting. He reached out. His hand hovered for a moment, then pushed. The door creaked open slowly, the sound cutting through the silence like a warning that came too late. Cold air spilled out from inside, and with it, something else. Ethan felt it immediately. Not fear, not exactly. Recognition. The kind you get when you step into a place where something happened and never really left. Behind him, Shadow didn't follow. He stayed exactly where he was, watching, waiting, because whatever was inside that cabin, Ethan was about to face it first. Alone. The door opened another inch with a slow, reluctant groan, as if the wood itself resisted being disturbed. Ethan pushed it wider with steady pressure, his boots planted firm against the warped threshold. Cold air rushed out to meet him, not the natural cold of mountain wind, but something still, trapped, stale. He stepped inside. The floor creaked under his weight, each sound echoing louder than it should have in the small space. Dust lifted into the air with every movement, catching thin streaks of light that slipped through cracks in the boarded windows. Ethan paused just inside the doorway, listened. Nothing. No animals. No wind inside. No shifting structure beyond the occasional low creak. But the silence didn't feel empty. It felt contained. He moved forward slowly. The cabin was a single room, small, bare. A stone fireplace sat against the far wall, blackened with soot from fires long gone. A crooked table leaned in one corner, one leg shorter than the others. A rusted lantern hung from a hook, unmoved for years. It was exactly what the listing promised. And yet, something didn't match. Ethan's eyes moved across the space with practiced precision. Corners first, then the ceiling, then the floor. Details, patterns, absences, no footprints, no debris piles where animals might have nested. No signs of collapse where time should have taken its toll. The place wasn't just abandoned. It had been left. Deliberately. Behind him, Shadow remained outside. Ethan could hear the faint crunch of snow as the dog shifted his position, pacing just beyond the doorway. The low growl hadn't stopped. It wasn't fear. It was warning. Ethan exhaled slowly. "I see it too," he muttered. He stepped deeper into the room. The floorboards responded with uneven groans beneath his boots, some solid, others softer, weaker. He adjusted his weight instinctively, avoiding pressure points without needing to think about it. Old habits. Survival habits. He crouched near the fireplace, brushing a gloved hand across the stone. Black soot came away easily, staining the fabric. "Not that old," he said under his breath. If the place had truly been untouched for years, the soot would have hardened, settled. This felt recent enough to matter. Ethan stood again, turned slowly. Something shifted. Not in the room. Inside him. The same quiet awareness that had kept him alive in places where hesitation meant death. He couldn't name it. But it was there. Watching. Waiting. Outside, Shadow barked once. Sharp. Controlled. Ethan turned toward the door. "What is it?" he called out. No answer. Just the wind brushing lightly against the cabin walls. Ethan stepped back toward the entrance. Shadow stood just beyond the threshold, body angled toward the surrounding forest, ears locked forward. His gaze wasn't on the cabin anymore. It was on the trees, tracking, listening. Ethan followed his line of sight. Nothing moved, nothing visible. But that didn't mean anything. "You picking something up?" Ethan asked quietly. Shadow didn't look at him, didn't break focus. Ethan nodded once. All right. He stepped back inside and pulled the door shut halfway, leaving it open just enough to keep the dog in view. Then he moved again, slower this time, more deliberate. He walked the perimeter of the cabin, counting steps without realizing it, measuring space, mapping it in his mind. 10 steps wide, 12 deep. Simple. Too simple. He stopped near the center of the room. Something about the way the floor felt beneath him shifted slightly. Not enough to see, not enough to hear clearly, but enough. Ethan stilled, then took a step back, then forward again. Same spot. There. A faint difference in the sound. Hollow, subtle, but real. Ethan frowned slightly. He crouched down, pressing his hand against the wood. The surface was rough, worn from time, but in this one spot it felt different, less solid, less anchored. He tapped it lightly with his knuckles. The sound came back duller than the rest. Ethan sat back on his heels. Interesting, he murmured. Outside, Shadow's growl deepened. Ethan glanced back toward the door again. Hold on, he said quietly. The dog didn't respond, didn't move, just watched the forest like something out there had already been seen. Ethan returned his attention to the floor. He ran his fingers along the seams between the boards, slower now, more focused. And then he felt it. A slight gap, not visible unless you were looking for it. Not natural. A seam that didn't belong. Ethan's jaw tightened just slightly. Someone put this here, he said. Not guessed. Known. He stood slowly, scanning the room again. No tools, nothing obvious. Just the same broken pieces of a place that pretended to be forgotten. Ethan walked to the fireplace and picked up the rusted iron poker leaning against the stone. It was heavier than it looked. Good enough. He returned to the center of the room and knelt again, positioning the tip of the poker carefully along the edge of the seam. For a moment he paused, not because he was afraid, because he understood something. This wasn't just about shelter anymore. This wasn't just about surviving the night. Whatever was under that floor, it had been hidden on purpose, and people don't hide things like that without a reason. Ethan pressed down. The wood resisted. Old, stubborn. He adjusted his grip and applied more pressure. The board shifted slightly. A small, dry crack broke the silence. Ethan froze, listened. Nothing changed. No movement outside. No sound inside. Just the same heavy stillness. He pressed again. This time the board lifted just enough to confirm it. Loose. Not broken. Placed. Ethan leaned back slowly. Didn't pull it open yet. Didn't rush. Instead, he sat there in the quiet, the poker still in his hand. The floor partially shifted beneath him. Thinking. Outside, Shadow's growl softened, but didn't stop. The dog wasn't reacting to the floor. He was reacting to something else. Something beyond the cabin. Ethan looked toward the door again, then back down at the loose board. Two problems. One inside, one outside. And he didn't know which one mattered more. Not yet. He stood slowly, setting the poker aside. Not tonight, he said quietly. Whatever was down there, it wasn't going anywhere. But whatever Shadow was sensing, that might. Ethan walked back toward the door, stepping out into the fading light. The forest stretched out around them, silent and endless. Shadow moved immediately to his side. Still tense, still watching. Ethan placed a hand briefly on the dog's back. All right, he said. We do this smart. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the clearing. Behind them, the cabin stood still, unmoving, unchanged, but no longer empty, and beneath its floor, something waited, patient, hidden, and no longer alone. The light drained quickly from the clearing. One moment the trees were outlined in gold, the next they were nothing but dark shapes pressing in from every side. The temperature dropped with it, the kind of mountain cold that didn't ask permission before settling into your bones. Ethan stepped back inside the cabin and pushed the door closed the rest of the way. The wood met the frame with a dull thud. Inside, the air felt tighter now, different than before. He stood still for a moment, listening. Shadow entered behind him, but reluctantly. The dog paused at the threshold again before stepping fully inside, his posture low and cautious. His eyes moved to the center of the floor, to the board Ethan had partially lifted. Ethan noticed. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I know." He moved to the fireplace and began gathering what little dry wood remained stacked near the wall. Most of it was brittle, old, but still usable. He worked with steady hands, building a small, contained fire, nothing large enough to draw attention from a distance. The first flame caught slowly, then steadied. Light flickered across the walls, pushing back the darkness just enough to see. Shadow remained standing, watching. Not the door, not the trees, the floor. Ethan sat on the edge of the crooked table and pulled off his gloves. The warmth from the fire barely reached him, but it was enough to remind his body it wasn't entirely exposed. For a few minutes, the cabin felt almost ordinary. Fire crackling, wood settling, wind brushing lightly outside. Then the quiet began to shift. It always did. Ethan leaned back slightly, his eyes half closed. The crackle of the fire sharpened. The wind outside became something else. Footsteps, voices, static in his ear. "Cole, left side!" Gunfire split through his memory. Bright flashes, sand in his mouth. The sound of someone shouting his name again. He inhaled sharply. The cabin disappeared for half a second. The firelight became muzzle flashes. The creak of wood became boots hitting ground too fast. His hands tightened automatically, searching for something that wasn't there. "Ethan." The voice was steady, close, not from memory. Shadow pressed hard against him, body solid, breathing slow and deliberate. Ethan blinked. The cabin came back into focus. Fire, walls, snow beyond the boarded windows. His heartbeat still pounded in his ears. Shadow's head rested against his chest, weight grounding him in the present. Ethan closed his eyes again, but this time intentionally. "Not here," he muttered quietly. "Not now." Shadow didn't move away until Ethan's breathing steadied. Even then, the dog didn't lie down. He turned slowly and walked toward the center of the cabin, toward the loose board. He stopped over it, stared, ears forward, then sat. Ethan watched him. "You're still on that, huh?" Shadow lowered his head and gave a low, uneasy whine. Not fear, urgency. Ethan stood slowly and walked toward him. He didn't touch the board, didn't lift it, just stood there beside the dog, staring down at the faint seam in the wood. "You think it's that simple?" he asked quietly. Shadow shifted his weight slightly, then pressed one paw gently against the edge of the board. The wood made that same hollow sound. Ethan exhaled. "Yeah," he said. "I hear it." But something else nagged at him. It wasn't just the hidden space, it was timing. The way the silence outside had shifted earlier. The way Shadow had reacted to the trees before focusing on the floor. There were layers here, and Ethan had learned the hard way. Nothing in isolation stays isolated for long. He walked to the door and cracked it open just enough to listen. The forest was still. Too still. No animal movement. No distant calls. Just wind. But even that sounded distant. Muted. Ethan closed the door again and locked it with the simple interior latch. He returned to the fire and sat on the floor this time, his back against the wall. Shadow stayed near the center, guarding the seam. Minutes passed. Then an hour. The fire burned lower. Ethan didn't sleep. He drifted in and out of half-conscious thought, never fully relaxed, never fully at ease. Each time his eyes closed, images flickered. Teammates. Night operations. The weight of decisions that never left him. And beneath it all, the steady presence of the dog. At some point in the night, Shadow stood abruptly. His head snapped toward the wall opposite the door. Ethan's eyes opened instantly. No delay. "What is it?" he whispered. Shadow's body stiffened. A low growl vibrated through the room. Not loud, not panicked, focused. Ethan held still, listened. At first, nothing. Then, a faint sound. Barely audible. A shift. Not from the trees. Not from the roof, from beneath. Ethan's gaze snapped to the floor, to the loose board. Shadow stepped directly over it now, his body between Ethan and the seam. Protective. Ethan's pulse slowed, not quickened. Slowed. Because this, he understood. He reached slowly for the poker beside the fireplace, moved carefully toward the center of the room. Shadow didn't move aside. He held his position. Ethan crouched, pressed his hand flat against the wood again. There. The faintest vibration, like something settling below. Not movement exactly, but space. Air shifting. Ethan's jaw tightened. "This place wasn't empty," he said quietly. Shadow's growl deepened. Ethan lifted his eyes toward the ceiling, listening for anything else. Nothing. Just the faint echo of something hidden beneath them. He leaned back slowly. Didn't pry the board open. Not yet. Instead, he stood and returned to the fire. Added one more piece of wood. Let the flame rise slightly. "If someone hid something down there," he murmured. "They didn't want it found fast." Shadow finally moved from the seam, but only to lie directly between it and Ethan, guarding both directions. The rest of the night passed in fragments, short stretches of silence, moments of sharp awareness. Shadow never fully relaxed, and Ethan never fully slept. By the time the first thin gray light filtered through the cracks in the boards covering the windows, they both knew. The cabin wasn't just shelter. It wasn't just abandoned. It was layered, purposeful, and whatever was beneath that floor, it wasn't there by accident. As the morning light strengthened, Shadow rose again, walked straight to the seam, and scratched. Once, then again. More insistent this time. Ethan watched him in silence. The fragile numbness from the day before was gone, replaced by something sharper, clearer. This wasn't about survival anymore. It was about discovery. And for the first time since he signed away his home, Ethan felt something that wasn't emptiness. He felt alert, alive. "All right," he said quietly. He picked up the poker. "This time," he told Shadow, "we find out." Outside, the forest remained silent. But inside the cabin, something was about to be uncovered, and it wasn't going to stay hidden much longer. Morning light filtered through the cracks in the boarded windows, cutting thin, pale lines across the cabin floor. The fire had burned down to embers, but the air felt sharper now, not colder, but clearer. Ethan stood over the loose board, poker in hand. Shadow positioned himself beside it, tense but silent, eyes fixed on the seam like he could see through the wood itself. "You were right," Ethan said quietly. The dog's ears twitched at his voice, but his gaze never shifted. Ethan crouched down and slid the metal tip of the poker back into the narrow gap he had found the night before. He adjusted his grip, careful, controlled, no rushing, no noise he didn't need. He pressed down slowly. The wood resisted for a second, then gave way with a dry crack that echoed louder than it should have in the small room. Shadow stepped back half a pace but didn't retreat. Ethan pried again, widening the opening just enough to get his fingers underneath. The board lifted unevenly, dust rising in a cloud that caught the morning light. Beneath it, darkness, not shallow, not empty. A cavity. Ethan set the poker aside and leaned closer, brushing away loose debris with the back of his hand. The space beneath the floor was deliberate. Clean lines cut through packed earth, reinforced framing along the edges. This wasn't rot. It was design. Shadow leaned in too, sniffing once, twice, then pulling back slightly, as if confirming something. Ethan reached down carefully. His fingers brushed against cold metal, solid, heavy. He gripped it and pulled. A rectangular steel box emerged from the hidden space, coated in dust but intact. No rust, no warping. It had been sealed properly. Beside it, wrapped tightly in oilcloth, were two bundled stacks of something flat. Documents. Ethan sat back on his heels, staring at what he had just uncovered. The cabin felt smaller now, charged. He lifted the metal box fully onto the floor and set it down gently. It had a latch at the front, locked, but not complex. "Someone didn't want this found by accident," he muttered. Shadow circled once and sat again, but his body remained tense. His eyes flicked briefly toward the door. Ethan noticed. "You still hearing something?" he asked. The dog didn't answer, of course, but his posture hadn't relaxed. Ethan turned his attention back to the bundles first. He untied the oilcloth slowly, unfolding layer after layer until thick stacks of aged paper came into view. Maps, survey diagrams, property boundaries marked in red and blue ink. Ethan's brow furrowed. He unfolded one of the larger sheets. It wasn't just the cabin plotted there. It was the entire mountain ridge, the surrounding forest, acres, more than he expected. His eyes moved to the lower corner of the page. A name, not his, not the county's, and the date, decades old. "Shadow," he said quietly. The dog's head tilted slightly. Ethan laid the map flat and reached for the second bundle. Deeds, transfer records, official stamps, some newer, some older. The paper was yellowed, but the ink remained clear. Ownership lines drawn, erased, redrawn, names changed, boundaries adjusted. And then, one document stopped him. Stamped, military clearance level marking faint but visible. Ethan's jaw tightened. "This isn't just land," he said. He sat back and exhaled slowly. Then his gaze shifted to the metal box. He studied the lock for a moment. Simple latch mechanism. Old. Strong enough to keep out curiosity, but not a determined hand. He picked up the poker again and wedged the tip under the latch. "One shot," he murmured. He applied steady pressure. The metal bent slightly. A sharp crack echoed as the lock snapped free. Shadow flinched at the sound, turning toward the door again. Ethan opened the lid slowly. Inside. More documents. More recent. Corporate letterheads. Survey reports. Environmental studies. And something else. Blueprints. Folded carefully. Ethan unfolded one across the floor. His breath slowed. Beneath the land plotted on the map were structural diagrams, subsurface layout, reinforced concrete sections, ventilation shafts, Access tunnels. Cold War-era installation markers. Ethan leaned back slowly. "This wasn't abandoned," he said. Shadow stood, walked to the door, gave one sharp bark. Not at the forest. At the driveway. Ethan froze. Then, the low hum of an engine reached him. Distant, but unmistakable. Ethan stood in one fluid motion, closed the metal box, gathered the topmost documents. Boots on gravel. Closer. Too fast. "Damn it," he muttered. Shadow moved to the center of the room, positioning himself between Ethan and the door, muscles coiled, ready. Ethan didn't panic. He folded the maps quickly and slid them back into the oilcloth. The metal box he pushed partially back toward the opening in the floor, but didn't seal it yet. The engine cut off outside. Silence returned. Different now. Intentional. Ethan stepped toward the door and cracked it open just enough to see. A black SUV sat in the clearing. Clean. Out of place. A man stepped out. Mid-40s, pressed jacket, shoes too polished for snow. He closed the door quietly and looked around like he had been here before. His eyes landed on the cabin, on the open door, on Ethan. The man smiled, polite, controlled. Shadow's growl deepened. Ethan stepped fully outside, closing the door behind him without locking it. He stood tall despite the cold. "What can I help you with?" Ethan asked. The man walked forward slowly, hands visible, posture relaxed, but calculated. "Morning," he said smoothly. "Name's Victor Hale." Ethan didn't offer his hand. "Mr. Cole," Victor continued, "I believe you recently purchased this property." "That's right." Victor glanced briefly at the cabin, then back at Ethan. "I'd like to buy it from you." Straight to it. No pretense. Ethan's eyes didn't shift. "On what basis?" he asked. Victor smiled slightly. "On the basis that it would save you trouble." "Trouble?" Victor's gaze flicked to Shadow. "Isolation. Structural issues. Liability." Shadow stepped forward half a pace. Victor noticed. Didn't flinch. "I'm prepared to offer you $20,000, Victor said. "Cash. Today." Ethan didn't react. Didn't blink. Inside his chest, something had shifted. 20,000. For a $5 cabin. Without stepping inside. Without inspection. He let the silence stretch, then asked quietly, "You drive all the way up here for a place nobody wanted yesterday?" Victor's smile thinned just slightly. "Opportunities change." Ethan held his gaze. "You didn't even ask what condition it's in." Victor paused. Just long enough. "I don't need to," he said. Behind Ethan, the cabin stood still. Beneath it, the truth. Shadow moved directly in front of Ethan now. Protective. Firm. Victor looked at the dog, then back at Ethan. "I'd think about it carefully," Victor said evenly. "You're not equipped to handle what this place involves." Ethan's voice remained calm. "I've handled worse." Victor studied him for a long second, then nodded once. 20,000, he repeated. "Offer stands, for now." He turned and walked back to the SUV. The engine started. The vehicle reversed slowly and disappeared back down the narrow trail. Silence returned. But it wasn't the same silence as before. Ethan stood still for a long moment, then turned toward the cabin. Shadow remained tense, alert, watching the road even after the vehicle vanished. Ethan exhaled slowly. "They knew," he said quietly. Shadow didn't move. They already knew. He stepped back inside the cabin and closed the door behind him. The maps lay half unfolded on the floor. The metal box still open, the hidden space exposed. This wasn't random. This wasn't luck. The cabin hadn't been forgotten. It had been buried, and someone out there didn't want it uncovered. Ethan looked at the documents again, then toward the door. The numbness from 2 days ago was gone. In its place, clarity. The mission had changed. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was holding something someone else wanted back. And now, he knew it mattered. More than $5. More than 20,000. Shadow moved to his side again. Solid. Unwavering. Ethan rested a hand briefly on the dog's head. "All right," he said quietly. "They just made this interesting." The word interesting didn't carry humor. It carried weight. Ethan closed the metal box fully this time and lowered it back into the hidden cavity. He slid the bundles of documents in after it, careful not to bend the edges, not to disturb the order. Then he replaced the loose board. Not perfectly, but enough. Shadow watched every movement, his posture still angled toward the door. "Good catch," Ethan muttered to him. "You saw it before I did." Shadow's ears flicked at the sound of his voice, but he didn't relax. Ethan stood and moved to the small window crack facing the clearing. He shifted one of the boards slightly to widen the gap just enough to see the tree line and the narrow trail leading out. Nothing moved. But that meant very little. He had learned long ago when someone makes an offer too fast, they aren't guessing. They're reacting. And that meant one thing. They already knew what was here. The realization didn't scare him. It sharpened him. The numbness that had followed him since signing those papers at his daughter's kitchen table had burned away. In its place, purpose. By late afternoon, Ethan had walked the perimeter of the clearing twice. He studied tracks in the snow, noting tire patterns, depth, direction. The SUV had come in confidently, not hesitating, not searching, which meant someone had given precise directions. This wasn't random interest in cheap land. This was targeted. Shadow moved beside him, nose low to the ground, tracking scent trails invisible to human eyes. When they reached the edge of the trees, the dog stopped abruptly and lifted his head. A low growl built again in his chest. Ethan followed his gaze. The road was empty, but the air felt disturbed. "You smell him?" Ethan asked quietly. Shadow's body stiffened further. Ethan nodded once. "Yeah, me too." They returned to the cabin before sunset. This time, Ethan didn't treat it like shelter. He treated it like a forward position. He reinforced the door with a spare beam he found near the fireplace. He moved the table closer to the wall to clear space in the center. He positioned himself where he could see both the door and the loose board without turning fully. Shadow lay near the entrance, not sleeping, waiting. Night came slower this time, not because it took longer, because Ethan was watching for it. The fire burned low again, casting long shadows across the cabin walls. For a moment, the silence almost felt calm. Then, headlights, faint at first, then stronger. Ethan didn't move immediately. Shadow did. He was on his feet before the engine became fully audible. The sound approached faster this time. More than one vehicle. Ethan stepped to the window crack again. Two sets of lights cut through the trees. Not the same SUV. One pickup, one dark sedan. They stopped short of the clearing, engines idling. Ethan's jaw tightened. "They don't wait long," he muttered. Shadow's growl deepened. Doors opened, boots hit snow. 3 figures stepped into the clearing this time. Victor Hale stood at the front. No smile now, just business. Behind him, 2 men, broader, heavier jackets, hands in pockets, not tourists. Victor called out calmly, "Mr. Cole, I believe we can revisit our conversation." Ethan didn't answer immediately. He stepped outside instead. Closed the reinforced door behind him. Shadow followed, positioning himself slightly in front of Ethan, body angled protectively. Victor noticed. "You move fast," Ethan said evenly. Victor glanced at the cabin. "So do you." A subtle shift in his tone, less polished, more direct. "I reconsidered," Victor continued. 20,000 was a preliminary offer. Ethan crossed his arms loosely. "Yeah?" 500,000, Victor said. The number hung in the cold air. $500,000 for a $5 cabin. Shadow stepped forward half a pace. Victor's eyes flicked to the dog. "You're not equipped to deal with what's beneath this land," Victor said quietly. "It's complicated. Legal issues, federal interests, environmental concerns." Ethan's gaze never left him. "You didn't mention that this morning." Victor's jaw tightened slightly. Circumstances changed. "No," Ethan replied calmly. "Information changed." The men behind Victor shifted their weight. Snow crunched. Victor exhaled slowly. "Take the offer," he said. "Walk away clean." Ethan's mind flicked briefly to the map under the floor, to the blueprint of reinforced concrete below the ridge, to the military stamp he recognized but hadn't fully processed yet. Then he thought about something else. The way Victor had known too quickly, the way he had driven straight to the cabin without scouting. "You weren't surprised I bought it," Ethan said quietly. Victor didn't respond. "You were surprised I opened it." A pause, barely visible, but there. Victor's expression hardened. "You don't know what you're dealing with," he said. Ethan stepped slightly to the side, giving Shadow room to move if needed. "I've heard that before," he replied. Victor's patience thinned. "You're not the only one who's interested in this property," he said. "And you're not the only one who knows about it," Ethan answered. Victor studied him, then nodded once. "You've got 48 hours, he said. "After that, we escalate." The word escalate lingered, not a threat spoken loudly, but implied clearly. Victor turned and walked back toward the vehicles. The other two men followed. Engines started. Headlights swung wide across the clearing one last time before disappearing down the trail. Silence returned, but it wasn't peaceful. It was loaded. Ethan stood still for a long moment. Shadow remained rigid, staring at the path long after the vehicles were gone. "They weren't bluffing," Ethan said quietly. Shadow didn't move. Ethan turned slowly back toward the cabin. Inside that small structure lay documents worth millions, evidence of something buried. And now, pressure. He stepped back inside and secured the door. The firelight flickered against the walls. For the first time since arriving. He wasn't reacting. He was calculating. "They know what's under there," he murmured. Shadow walked to the loose board and sat directly on top of it, guarding it, as if he understood the stakes. Ethan crouched in front of him. "They didn't expect resistance," he said. Shadow's eyes held his. "And they definitely didn't expect you." Ethan rested a hand briefly on the dog's neck. Warm, steady, loyal. 48 hours. The offer had jumped from 20,000 to $500,000 in less than a day. That wasn't negotiation. That was desperation. And desperation meant vulnerability. Ethan stood slowly. His back straightened in a way it hadn't in years. The man who had walked away from his home with a duffel bag wasn't standing here now. The man who had led teams through uncertainty was. "They came too fast," he said quietly. Shadow's ears lifted. "Which means they're afraid." Outside, the wind shifted direction. The forest remained dark. But something fundamental had changed. This wasn't about survival anymore. It was about control. And Ethan Cole had just been handed a new mission. He wasn't leaving. Not this time. Not for money. Not for pressure. And not for fear. He glanced once more at the floor beneath his feet, then toward the door. "They want it back," he said. Shadow didn't blink. "So we make them work for it." The cabin felt smaller that night, not because of the walls, but because of the weight inside it. Ethan didn't sleep. He sat at the crooked table with the oilcloth bundle open again, the metal box beside him, maps spread across the uneven wood. The fire had burned low, replaced by the cold blue light of a battery lantern he found tucked into one of his duffel bag pockets. Outside, the wind shifted direction twice. Shadow lay near the door, head down but eyes open. Watching. Waiting. Ethan unfolded the largest blueprint again. This time he studied it slowly, carefully. The lines weren't random. They weren't temporary field structures either. The reinforced shapes beneath the ridge were deliberate. Thick concrete. Secured access points. Multiple ventilation shafts disguised within the forest canopy. Cold War era. He recognized the layout. He had seen similar structures overseas. Remote installations built quietly, erased from maps when they became inconvenient. This wasn't just storage, he murmured. He traced a finger along one marked section. Underground surveillance grid, a network, the kind that monitored movement, tracked signals, intercepted communications. But what mattered wasn't just what it was why it had been hidden. Ethan shifted to the stack of deeds. Ownership records showed the land originally registered under a private holding group decades ago, then transferred, then subdivided, then quietly dissolved. Boundaries redrawn, portions sold, portions abandoned, and always this cabin left untouched, isolated, forgotten. Except it wasn't forgotten. It was the anchor, the access point, the only physical trace that still tied the land to its original claim. They tried to erase it, Ethan said quietly. Shadow lifted his head slightly at the tone in his voice. But they missed something. The metal box held newer records, corporate filings from a company Ethan had never heard of, cross-referenced coordinates, environmental surveys disguised as timber assessments. Every document circled back to one fact. The land surrounding this cabin was worth millions, and not just for timber, mineral rights, subsurface control, strategic positioning. Ethan leaned back slowly in his chair. Victor hadn't been offering generosity. He'd been offering silence. $500,000 wasn't a purchase. It was a buyout. A cleanup. Shadow stood abruptly. His body stiffened toward the back wall of the cabin. Not the door this time. The wall. Ethan froze. "Again?" he asked quietly. Shadow moved slowly toward the rear corner, nose low, tracking something faint along the floor. Ethan stood and followed. The dog paused near a section of wall where the logs met the stone base. Then he scratched once, soft but deliberate. Ethan crouched, ran his hand along the stone foundation. Cold, solid. But one section felt slightly hollow when tapped. Not a cavity like the floor, something narrower. Ventilation shaft. He stood and moved outside immediately. Snow crunched under his boots as he circled the cabin, studying the tree line more closely. It took him a moment to see it. A metal grate, camouflaged beneath brush and fallen branches. Small, subtle, perfectly placed. He cleared it gently. Air flowed faintly upward. Warm. Not natural warmth. Not geothermal. Controlled airflow. Ethan's breath slowed. "They're not just hiding documents," he said. He stepped back and scanned the clearing. If this structure still functioned, even partially, someone else might already know, might already be monitoring. He looked toward the narrow road, then back to the cabin. "Shadow," he called softly. The dog appeared at the doorway instantly. Ethan pointed toward the grate. Shadow approached cautiously, sniffed once, then backed away with a low growl. Not fear. Warning. Ethan nodded once. Understood. They went back inside. Ethan closed the door and leaned against it briefly. This wasn't just property. This wasn't just land rights. It was buried federal infrastructure. Erased, repurposed, or hidden. And if Victor's group wanted it back so badly, it meant something inside that structure still mattered. He gathered the documents carefully, rewrapped the bundles. But this time, he didn't hide them under the floor. Instead, he placed the most critical pieces into his duffel bag. If things escalated, he wouldn't risk losing the proof. Shadow returned to his position near the door. The firelight flickered across the walls again, but the cabin no longer felt abandoned. It felt contested. By midnight, the wind died down completely. Silence settled in again. Too clean. Ethan lay back against the wall, eyes open, listening. His mind ran through possibilities. Corporate land grab, federal cover-up, outdated surveillance base, or something still active. He didn't know yet. But he knew this. Victor had underestimated him, and whoever Victor answered to had underestimated Shadow. The dog's ears twitched suddenly, head snapping toward the tree line. Ethan was on his feet before the sound reached him. A faint crunch. Snow shifting under weight. Not wind. Footsteps. Outside. Ethan moved to the side of the door silently. Shadow positioned himself low and forward. Another crunch. Closer. Ethan didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't need one. He reached for calm. Breathing steady. Posture aligned. The door handle shifted slightly. Tested. Shadow's growl deepened into something feral. The handle stopped. A pause. Then, footsteps retreating. Quick. Controlled. Not panicked. Ethan waited. Counted to 30. Then opened the door suddenly. The clearing was empty, but the snow near the edge of the tree line told the story. Fresh tracks. Not from Victor's SUV, boot prints. One person. Light tread. Professional. Ethan knelt beside the prints, measured the depth, weight distribution, calculated. "They're scouting," he murmured. Shadow stood over him protectively. Ethan stood slowly. "They want to know what we found." The mountain air felt thinner now, tighter. The isolation that once felt like safety had shifted into vulnerability. But Ethan didn't retreat. He turned back toward the cabin. "This just got bigger," he said quietly. Shadow followed. Inside, the documents lay sealed in the duffel bag. The metal box remained hidden. The loose board back in place, but now, Ethan understood the scale. This wasn't just about money. This wasn't just about land. This was about control over something that had been buried for decades, and someone out there was willing to push harder to get it back. Ethan extinguished the lantern. Darkness filled the room. He sat against the wall again, eyes open, Shadow beside him. Both alert, both awake. The offer had escalated. The pressure had escalated. And now, the danger had shifted from financial to physical. But Ethan Cole wasn't leaving. Not after what he'd seen. Not after what they tried to hide. He rested his hand lightly on Shadow's back. "They thought nobody would come back for this," he said. Shadow's breathing remained slow, steady. And they were wrong. The night did not soften after that. It tightened. Every sound felt amplified. The faint shift of timber in the walls, the distant snap of branches under snow settling in the trees. Ethan remained seated against the cabin wall, back straight, breath controlled. Shadow lay beside him, but not relaxed, coiled, waiting. Near dawn, the forest exhaled. The wind returned lightly, erasing some of the tracks from the night before. When gray light finally filtered through the cracks in the boards, Ethan rose slowly. "We don't wait anymore," he said quietly. Shadow stood instantly. Ethan stepped outside and scanned the clearing again. The fresh footprints from the night had been partially blurred, but they were still visible near the tree line. Whoever had approached had stayed just beyond the open space. Testing. Watching. Ethan walked the perimeter once more, this time placing small markers of his own. Subtle disturbances in snow, sticks positioned deliberately near the path, patterns only he would recognize if moved. Old habits. Not paranoia. Preparation. By mid-morning, the mountain air carried a different sound. Engines again, but louder, closer. Not cautious this time. Ethan didn't hide. He stood in the clearing as two vehicles approached, Victor's black SUV and a second truck behind it. Shadow positioned himself slightly in front of Ethan, posture tall, eyes locked forward. The vehicles stopped cleanly. Victor stepped out first. No smile. No polite introduction. Behind him stood two men again. Heavier coats this time. Expressions tight. Victor didn't waste time. 500,000, he said. Final courtesy. Ethan's face remained neutral. Courtesy implies choice, he replied. Victor's jaw flexed. 1 million, he said flatly. The number hung in the air like something fragile. $1 million. For $5. Shadow's low growl vibrated through the clearing. Victor ignored the dog this time. This can end quietly, Victor continued, or it can become unnecessarily complicated. Ethan stepped forward half a pace. It already is. Victor exhaled sharply. You don't understand the scale of what you're interfering with. I understand you're desperate, Ethan said calmly. The wind shifted between them. Victor glanced briefly toward the cabin, then back at Ethan. You've had visitors, he said. It wasn't a question. Ethan didn't answer. Victor's eyes hardened. Take the money, he said. Walk away. Ethan held his gaze. No. Silence. Tension coiled tight between the trees. Victor nodded slowly, as if confirming something to himself. Then this moves to phase 2. He turned without another word and returned to the SUV. The vehicles reversed and disappeared down the path. The clearing fell silent again. Shadow's posture remained rigid long after the sound faded. Ethan looked down at him. That wasn't a bluff, he murmured. By late afternoon, clouds rolled in thick over the ridge. Snow began falling again, slow at first, then steady. Ethan reinforced the cabin further. He repositioned furniture, secured loose boards, kept the documents sealed inside his duffel bag. As dusk settled, Shadow became restless, not anxious, focused. He paced near the door, then paused at the rear wall again, listening. Ethan stilled. He heard it too this time. Faint movement, closer than before. Not the front clearing, the back. Ethan extinguished the lantern and moved silently toward the wall. He pressed his ear lightly against the wood. A scrape. Metal on stone, then a whisper of breath. Someone was near the rear ventilation shaft. Shadow's growl dropped into a deep, vibrating warning. Ethan opened the door quietly and stepped into the darkness, circling the cabin slowly. Snow muffled his footsteps. He saw the shadow first, a figure crouched near the metal grate he had uncovered earlier, working at it, trying to access it. Ethan didn't shout. He moved forward deliberately. Shadow burst from the cabin before Ethan could command him. Fast, silent. The figure turned too late. Shadow lunged, not to maul, not to attack wildly, but to intercept. He knocked the man off balance, pinning him to the snow with controlled force. The man struggled briefly, startled more than injured. Ethan reached them in seconds. "Don't move," he said firmly. The man froze. Snow fell steadily around them. Ethan saw it clearly now. This wasn't a local. Clean boots, utility gloves, professional posture, scouting, just as he suspected. Shadow held his position, teeth bared but not biting, waiting for Ethan's cue. "Who sent you?" Ethan asked. No answer. The man's jaw tightened. Ethan leaned closer. "Victor?" Still no response. But the silence was confirmation enough. From the trees behind them. A second shadow moved. Ethan's eyes snapped up. Too late. A sharp sound split the quiet, metal striking wood. Shadow reacted instantly, releasing the first man and pivoting toward the new movement. Another figure emerged from the tree line, advancing quickly. Shadow launched again. There was a shout, a scuffle in the snow. Ethan moved forward, then stopped. Shadow yelped. Not a bark, not a growl. Pain. Sharp. Immediate. Ethan's chest tightened. "Shadow!" he called. The second figure retreated abruptly, disappearing back into the forest. The first man scrambled to his feet and ran after him without looking back. Snow swallowed their retreating forms. Ethan dropped to his knees beside Shadow. The dog was standing, but favoring his front leg. Breathing fast, eyes still alert. "Easy," Ethan said, voice steady but tight. He ran his hands carefully along the leg. A shallow cut near the shoulder. Not deep, but bleeding. Likely from a sharp tool or metal edge during the struggle. "You held them," Ethan whispered. Shadow leaned into him slightly. Still guarding. Even injured. Ethan lifted him gently and carried him inside the cabin. He closed the door firmly and barred it. Then he set Shadow down near the fire and opened his pack. Field instincts returned without hesitation. Clean cloth, water, pressure, assessment. The cut wasn't life-threatening, but it was deliberate. A warning. "They're escalating," Ethan murmured. He cleaned the wound carefully while Shadow stayed still, trusting him completely. Snow continued falling outside. The cabin felt smaller again, but not powerless. Ethan wrapped the bandage securely. Shadow licked his hand once. Ethan exhaled slowly. "You did good," he said quietly. The dog's breathing steadied. He lowered himself beside Ethan, injured leg tucked carefully beneath him. Outside, the forest swallowed all trace of the intruders. But the message was clear now. This wasn't negotiation anymore. This was intimidation. And they had crossed a line. Ethan looked at the duffel bag resting near the wall. The documents inside felt heavier now. Not because of value, because of consequence. He rested his hand gently on Shadow's back. "They think we'll back down," he said. Shadow's eyes met his. "They think pressure works." The fire crackled softly. Snow thickened beyond the windows. Ethan's posture straightened slowly. "They don't know us," he murmured. The numbness from weeks ago was gone. The hesitation from signing away his house had burned off completely. What remained was resolve, protective, focused, and no longer alone. The threat had shifted from financial to physical, but so had Ethan, and this time, he wasn't walking away. Morning broke heavy and gray over the ridge. Snow had buried most of the tracks from the night before, smoothing the clearing into something deceptively peaceful. The world looked untouched again. But Ethan knew better. He stepped outside carefully, scanning the perimeter before moving farther than the cabin wall. The air felt thinner this morning, colder, sharper. Shadow followed him, favoring his bandaged shoulder, but refusing to stay behind. His gait was slightly uneven, but his eyes were steady, alert. "You should be resting," Ethan muttered. Shadow ignored him. Of course he did. Ethan crouched near the rear of the cabin, brushing snow aside where the ventilation grate sat partially exposed. The marks from the previous night had vanished under fresh powder, but the intent remained. They had tried to access the structure beneath the ridge, and they would try again. Ethan stood slowly. Staying here alone wasn't enough anymore. He needed leverage. He needed legality. He needed someone who understood paper battles as well as he understood terrain. By mid-morning, he secured the cabin as best he could and packed the most critical documents into his duffel bag. He left the metal box hidden, but memorized its placement. "Back soon," he told Shadow quietly. The dog stepped into position immediately, ready to follow. They moved down the mountain trail together, Ethan navigating carefully around ice patches while Shadow stayed close despite his injury. The small mountain town came into view hours later, unchanged, unaware of what lay buried just miles above. Ethan didn't stop at the diner. He didn't go to the gas station. He walked straight into a modest brick office at the corner of Main Street. The sign read, "Rachel Turner, Attorney at Law." Inside, the office smelled of paper and coffee. Bookshelves lined the walls. Framed certificates hung behind a tidy wooden desk. A woman in her early 50s looked up as the door opened. She noticed Ethan first, then Shadow. Her eyes paused on the bandage. "Can I help you?" she asked calmly. Ethan stepped forward and set the duffel bag on the desk. "I hope so." Rachel Turner studied him carefully as he unfolded the maps and deeds across her desk. She didn't interrupt as he explained, starting with the purchase, then the hidden cavity, the documents, the visits, the escalating offers. She listened, not with disbelief, with focus. When he finished, she leaned back slowly in her chair. "May I?" she asked, lifting one of the maps. Ethan nodded. Her eyes moved across the boundaries, then to the corporate filings, then to the older deeds. Her expression changed subtly. "Where exactly is this property?" she asked. "North Ridge, past Timber Creek." She looked up sharply. "That land's been in dispute for decades." "Dispute how?" "Quietly," she replied. "Ownership transfers that never lined up properly. Corporate consolidation. Mineral rights questions." Ethan folded his arms loosely. "They offered me $1 million. Rachel's eyebrows lifted slightly. "That tells me 2 things," she said. 1, they believe you have legitimate claim. 2, they don't want this going public. She tapped one of the older deeds. "These filings were never properly voided," she continued. "If this holds, then the land beneath that cabin still legally ties back to original registration." "Which means," Ethan asked, "which means they may have built around it without fully clearing title." Silence filled the room. Shadow shifted his weight slightly beside Ethan. Rachel glanced at the bandage again. "They've already made this physical, haven't they?" Ethan met her eyes. "Yes." She nodded once. "Then we escalate properly." The word escalate felt different coming from her. Not threat. Procedure. Rachel began pulling additional county records, cross-referencing filings, checking archives. The deeper she looked, the clearer it became. "They redrew boundaries after federal contracts expired," she said quietly. "But this central structure, this cabin, it was never properly acquired." Ethan exhaled slowly. "So they built around it?" "Yes," she replied. "And if what you're saying about an underground installation is accurate," she paused, "they have a liability problem." Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. "Good." Rachel closed the file stack and looked directly at him. "They will file a preliminary claim, she said, to establish control before this gains attention. How long? Soon. Ethan nodded. Then we don't wait. Rachel's eyes narrowed slightly, not in doubt, but in assessment. You understand, she said carefully. This won't be quick. They have resources, lawyers, time. Ethan glanced down at Shadow briefly. I've worked against worse odds. Rachel's gaze softened just slightly. Then we start today. By late afternoon, she had drafted initial filings asserting Ethan's claim to the property. She requested injunctions preventing corporate transfer until ownership disputes were resolved. Paper warfare. Measured. Calculated. When Ethan stepped back outside with Shadow beside him, the sun had begun sinking low over the mountains. The town moved quietly around them, unaware of the legal ripple beginning to form. You're not alone in this now, Rachel had said before he left. Ethan drove back up the mountain trail with a different weight in his chest. Not fear, not anger. Direction. The cabin came into view as dusk settled. He parked and stepped out cautiously. The clearing looked undisturbed, but that didn't mean it was. Shadow scanned the tree line carefully before stepping forward. Inside, everything remained in place. The loose board untouched, the fire pit cold. Ethan secured the door again and leaned briefly against it. They'll push harder, he said quietly. Shadow lay down near the center of the cabin, guarding the floor once more. Ethan unfolded the legal documents Rachel had prepared and set them on the table. Now it wasn't just resistance. It was formal, official, public. They wouldn't be able to bury this quietly anymore. Outside, the wind returned lightly through the trees. The snow softened under moonlight. Ethan sat beside Shadow and rested a hand lightly on the dog's back. Next time they come, he said softly, we're ready. Shadow's breathing remained slow, steady. The mission had shifted again, from discovery to defense, from survival to stand. And this time, Ethan wasn't fighting alone. He had proof, he had counsel, and he had a dog who refused to retreat. The mountain felt different now, not like isolation, like ground held, and Ethan Cole intended to keep it that way. The next 48 hours moved differently, not frantic, not chaotic, deliberate. Ethan fortified the cabin in ways that wouldn't draw attention from a distance. He reinforced entry points, repositioned supplies, mapped sightlines from each window crack. He wasn't preparing for violence. He was preparing for pressure. Shadow stayed close, shoulder healing steadily, though he still favored it slightly when turning too fast. The dog's eyes missed nothing. Every time wind brushed the ridge or a branch snapped in the forest, his head lifted. They waited. On the third morning, Ethan's phone buzzed in his pocket. Signal had returned faintly on the ridge. He stepped outside to answer. Cole, he said. It's Rachel, came the steady reply. They filed. Ethan exhaled slowly. How aggressive. Preliminary claim for mineral and subsurface control, she said. They're attempting to argue that the underground installation was never privately owned. Ethan looked toward the forest line. They're trying to separate the land from what's under it. Yes, Rachel replied. But they made a mistake. Ethan waited. They submitted documentation that references structural blueprints dating back to 1973, she continued. Those same blueprints align with the copies you found. And they were never properly decommissioned. Silence settled briefly between them. Rachel's voice lowered slightly. If this becomes public, it won't just be a land dispute. It becomes a federal oversight question. Ethan nodded slowly. They don't want that. No, she agreed. They don't. Then they'll try one more time, Ethan said quietly. Rachel didn't argue. I'm filing an injunction today, she said. You hold steady. I will. He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. Shadow stood beside him, reading his posture. They're nervous, Ethan murmured. The mountain air felt lighter that morning, clearer. By mid-afternoon, a single vehicle approached. Not two, not three, just Victor's black SUV. Ethan stepped outside before it stopped fully. Shadow positioned himself at his side. Victor stepped out slowly, hands visible. No backup, no raised voices, just calculation. I assume you've spoken with counsel, Victor said calmly. I have, Ethan replied. Victor's gaze flicked briefly toward the tree line, then back to Ethan. You're making this far larger than necessary. You already did that, Ethan said evenly. Victor exhaled through his nose. You think exposing this will help you? He asked. You think federal agencies will thank you? Ethan held his ground. I think truth doesn't stay buried forever. Victor's expression tightened slightly. You have no idea what was built under that ridge, he said. I've seen enough, Ethan replied. Victor stepped closer, lowered his voice. 1.5 million, he said quietly. Final offer. The number felt different this time, not tempting, desperate. Shadow's ears flicked, but he didn't growl. He watched. Victor continued. You walk away, quietly, no claims, no filings. We handle the rest. Ethan didn't respond immediately. He looked past Victor toward the trees, toward the hidden ventilation shaft, toward the snow-covered ridge that concealed decades of erased decisions. You're not protecting the land, Ethan said finally. You're protecting what it proves. Victor's jaw flexed. And what do you think it proves? Ethan met his eyes. That it was never legally yours. Silence stretched. Wind brushed between them. Victor's posture shifted subtly. You're stepping into territory you don't understand, he said quietly. I understand integrity, Ethan replied. Victor stared at him for a long moment. Then something changed. Not anger. Resignation. You're not the man they expected, Victor said. Good, Ethan answered. Victor glanced once toward Shadow. That dog almost cost my associate his hand. He shouldn't have reached for something that wasn't his, Ethan replied calmly. Victor's lips pressed thin. You realize this will go beyond you, he said. It already has, Ethan said. Rachel's injunction filing hit the county registry that afternoon. By evening, local reporters had begun asking quiet questions about disputed land records near Timber Creek. The story wasn't public yet, but it was moving. Victor looked at Ethan one last time. You've chosen your line, he said. Yes. Victor nodded once, then turned and returned to his SUV. He drove away without looking back. The clearing felt larger after he left, less suffocating. Shadow remained alert but relaxed slightly once the vehicle disappeared. Ethan stood still for a moment, then exhaled. Inside the cabin, the legal papers lay neatly stacked beside the original deeds. 2 timelines, 2 truths, colliding. Later that night, Rachel called again. They withdrew, she said. Ethan leaned against the wall slowly. Withdrawn what? The preliminary claim, full retreat. Ethan didn't speak for a second. They'll try something else? He asked. No, Rachel replied. Not legally, not with those documents in circulation. Ethan's gaze drifted toward the hidden seam in the floor. They don't want a hearing, he murmured. They never did, she said. After the call ended, Ethan sat quietly by the fire. Shadow lay beside him. The cabin no longer felt contested. It felt anchored. The underground structure beneath the ridge still existed, The records still proved its improper transfer, but the immediate threat had receded. Ethan ran a hand slowly over Shadow's bandaged shoulder. "You did good," he said softly. The dog leaned slightly into his touch. Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees. Not sharp, not warning, just present. The truth had surfaced, and instead of collapsing under it, the pressure had cracked. Victor had offered money, threatened consequence, sent men in the night. But when forced into light, he stepped back. Ethan stared into the fire. He thought about the kitchen table in Colorado, about signing papers he didn't read closely enough, about walking away once before. He wasn't that man now. This time, he had chosen to stand, and the ground had held. The morning after Victor withdrew his claim, the mountain felt different, not quieter, clearer. Sunlight spilled over the ridge in long, deliberate streaks, melting the top layer of snow and revealing the rough earth beneath. The cabin no longer looked abandoned. It looked claimed. Ethan stepped outside with a mug of black coffee warming his hands. Shadow moved beside him, shoulder nearly healed now, posture strong again. They stood in the clearing together. For the first time since arriving, Ethan allowed himself to breathe fully. No approaching engines, no distant crunch of boots, no offers, no threats. Just wind through pine and the steady rhythm of his own pulse. He looked down at Shadow. "We're not done," he said quietly. Shadow's tail moved once against the snow. Over the next week, the legal confirmation arrived formally. Rachel drove up the mountain herself, her sedan crawling slowly over the uneven trail until it reached the clearing. She stepped out carefully, boots sinking slightly into thawing snow, and approached the cabin with measured curiosity. "You weren't exaggerating," she said, glancing at the ridgeline. Ethan handed her the official notice. She read it once, then again. "They've fully withdrawn," she confirmed. "No further claim on mineral rights, no subsurface ownership challenge. The property stands under your name, intact." Ethan nodded. "And the installation?" he asked. Rachel closed the folder. "Classified assets eventually get decommissioned quietly," she said, "but not always cleanly. My guess is they wanted to consolidate everything without reopening federal review." Ethan looked toward the forest. "And now?" "Now," she said calmly, "it's yours, legally, completely." The word yours lingered. It felt unfamiliar. Shadow nudged Ethan's hand gently. Rachel studied the dog's healing shoulder. "He earned this too," she said softly. Ethan allowed the faintest smile. After she left, the clearing felt bigger. Not because anything changed physically, because the pressure had lifted. But something else remained. A question. Ethan walked the ridge that afternoon, carrying the original map folded carefully under his arm. He stood above the hidden ventilation shaft, looking down at the forest canopy stretching beyond. He could sell. The offers would return quietly through intermediaries. He could take the money, move somewhere warm, disappear into comfort. Shadow stood beside him, eyes scanning the horizon. Ethan thought about the men he had served with. Men who returned home and couldn't find ground to stand on. Men who felt erased, overlooked, like he had felt the day he signed those papers in Colorado. He folded the map slowly. "This isn't about money," he murmured. That night, he built a larger fire in the cabin hearth. Not for defense, for warmth. The space no longer felt temporary. He repaired the crooked table, replaced the boards on the windows, cleared a wider path through the snow leading into the clearing. Word traveled quietly, first through Rachel, then through a veterans outreach contact in town. "Cole's got land up north," someone said. "Private, quiet." The first visitor arrived 2 weeks later. A man in his early 60s stepped hesitantly into the clearing, boots worn thin, eyes tired in a way Ethan recognized immediately. "I heard you might understand," the man said simply. Ethan didn't ask questions. He nodded once. "Come in." Shadow approached the visitor carefully, sniffed once, then stepped aside. The man relaxed visibly. Over time, others followed. Not crowds, not publicity. Just men and women who needed quiet, needed distance, needed ground that didn't feel unstable beneath their feet. Ethan cleared more of the surrounding land gradually, building simple structures from fallen timber. A small shared fire pit, a repaired shed converted into sleeping quarters. Nothing elaborate, nothing flashy. Just space. Purpose. Shadow adapted naturally. He greeted newcomers with calm authority, walking the perimeter at night, resting near the fire during the day. His presence settled people before Ethan ever spoke. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the ridge in gold, Rachel visited again. She stood beside Ethan near the edge of the clearing, watching 3 veterans sit near the fire quietly, talking in low voices. "You could have taken the $1.5 million, she said softly. Ethan nodded. "I know." "Do you regret it?" He looked toward the cabin, at the repaired windows, at the steady smoke rising from the chimney, at Shadow sitting tall beside the group, watchful but relaxed. "No," Ethan said. Rachel studied him for a moment. "You changed the narrative," she said. Ethan considered that. "I stopped running from it," he replied. Later that night, after everyone had settled, Ethan sat alone on the cabin steps. Shadow lay beside him, head resting on his paws. The mountain was quiet again, but not empty. He thought about the kitchen table in Colorado, about the pen scratching across paper, about standing on the roadside with nowhere to go. He thought about the $5 listing, the hollow sound beneath the floor, the hidden box, the engines in the snow, the offer, the threat, the stand. And he realized something. The cabin had never been the real discovery. Neither had the underground structure. The real discovery had been this. He wasn't done. Not at 65. Not erased. Not invisible. He ran his hand slowly over Shadow's head. "You found it?" he said softly. Shadow looked up at him. Not the land. Not the installation. Not the money. The choice. The moment he decided not to walk away again. The fire crackled gently in the distance. Wind moved through the trees like a steady breath. The ground beneath the ridge remained quiet. And Ethan Cole, former Navy SEAL, displaced father, reluctant landowner, finally understood what the cabin had given him. Not wealth, not revenge, not proof. It had given him back his footing. And beside him, loyal and steady as always, Shadow remained exactly where he belonged, right at his side. If you believe a man has the right to stand his ground and protect what's his, type yes in the comments and tell us where you're watching from. Around here, we believe dignity isn't for sale, and some ground is worth holding. If stories like this mean something to you, go ahead and subscribe. There's more justice, loyalty, and second chances waiting on the next ridge.